Good evening, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you so much for joining me this evening, tonight, on the Silburn Show. Today is the 27th of October, 2024. And of course, the Sunday night is the time where I like to have this sort of fireside chat, some sort of having these discussions. And I believe that in light of the fact that we're talking about Black history, I started using these Saturdays, Sundays as some sort of discussions on issues within the Black history realm. And I want to thank those who are joining me on TikTok, those joining me on Instagram, Facebook, and primarily on YouTube. If you want to join me on YouTube, you can go on to Silburn TV and you can share as much as possible. If you're on TikTok, all you're going to see is just my face. You don't want to see just my face. But you go onto YouTube or Facebook where you can see everybody. You know what I'm trying to say? See the lovely Nicola Millington, see lovely Dr. Carlton Browm, and the awesome Professor Les Henry. Instead of just seeing myself, you can hear the voices as well. You know, the race paradox, and this is one of the issues that I want to talk about tonight. The race paradox is why organizations fail on race. That is a very interesting thing, And today I want to talk about the critical complex issue that affect almost every organization, whether they choose to acknowledge it or not. They call it the race paradox. It's a conundrum that so many companies face, and unfortunately, so many fail to address meaningfully. They fail to address race. So let's start with the hard truth. For most organizations, the efforts they make to address racial issues, however well-intentioned, end up as mere window dressing. It's easy to launch a diversity initiative or celebrate a cultural day. It's easy to send out statements and make social media posts about equality. But why, despite all the diversity training, inclusion programs, and promises for change, do we still see the same lack of representation, the same limited progress, and worse yet, the same silence? The race paradox is about the gap between intention and impact, where organizations say they want diversity, but in reality, their systems, bias, and decision-making processes actively keep racial minorities from thriving. Now, when I look at the whole thing, there's a book which is in the formation. Should I say the formation? It's a book by Professor Dr. Carlton Browm. And it talks about, it's very thought-provoking, and comprehensive look of uncovering the root cause of persistent racial inequalities in the workplace. Dr. Carlton Browm began by examining the history of racial discrimination and how it has shaped the societal context in which organizations operate. And he argues that despite concerted efforts towards diversity and inclusions, organizations often fail to create equitable spaces for people of color. Yeah, it's many more, but I won't go into much detail more. I'll just bring in Dr. Carlton Browm and bring in my guest. So first of all, I'll bring in Dr. Carlton Browm. Good afternoon, sir. How are you, sir?
Good evening, Silburn. I'm very well, thank you, sir. Are you well? Thank you for the invitation for coming on the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm enjoying it all the way in Jamaica here, and I'm in straight out of Otrius, and I'm trying to say my dream. And then we're bringing Nicola Millington, PR guru. How are you, Nicola?
I'm doing great, all the way in Romford.
Just for the record, I'm in Catford on the Sea. Sometimes
okay.
On the sea, sometimes it's a Southend on the sea. I'm in Carlton on the sea. And I'm then Professor Les Henry. Professor Henry, how are you doing, sir?
Yeah, greetings everyone. I'm good, and I give thanks for the invite and give thanks to share a stage with Nicola and Brother Carlton, Sis Nicola and Brother Carlton, and my brother you as well. So I give it thanks.
Thanks. We're in awesome companies. Dr. Carlton Browm, let's start the ball rolling with your book, sir. The Race Paradox. Just sort of set out the stage for me, if you don't mind.
Over the last 20, 30, 40 years, there's a history of celebrating and people discussing race in a contextual sense, in terms of saying how we're moving on as a society. But unfortunately, reality is very different, and there's a real disconnect between what organizations are purporting to to say what they do versus what they actually do, and that is seen in so many different arenas. Whether that's we talk about leadership teams, whether we talk about representation in supplier diversity, in the boardroom, in the training room, in the recruitment process. There's so much disparity. I mean, if I think about the early settings, there was a review by a lady called McGregor, the McGregor Review, in 2017, and she said that everybody deserves the chance and the opportunity to have equal opportunity to fulfill their potential in society and within businesses, in organizations. And if you were taking that as the premise, you think about the boardroom, there's still not one black CEO in the UK today, in the FTSE 100 companies. If you take that across in America, they call it the Fortune 500 companies. That represents, whilst black and the African American community represents 13% of the labor force in America, less than 1.6%. It's only 8 people in the Fortune 500. Here, 1% of professors. And we have one here right on our show, out of 500, represents professors, despite the number of PhD people that people hold in the UK. So we think about the boardroom. We think about supplier diversity. The supplier diversity in the public sector is an example. It represents £290 billion worth of revenue for procurement. And black and ethnic minorities represent 7% of that business space. But less than 0.1% of the revenue goes to black and ethnic minority groups. So what I'm saying, if you look in different areas of society, right, there are still the significant disparities. We look at training, we look at recruitment. We know that disproportionately we have to still apply 6 or 7 times more CVs if you have a foreign sounding name to get access to an interview for an opportunity. So there's lots of different areas. And only in 2021, I think it was, there was a guy called Sir John Parker Review. And he said that the boardroom needs to reflect the society that we live in. And it doesn't. So what I'm saying, I like, I don't know if they know me, I like data, because whilst you can tell a story, data doesn't tell you, data tells you and demonstrates the narrative, supports and underpins the narrative of what's going on. So there's a real disconnect, I feel. And the data tells us that. And even if you think about wealth gaps, poverty gaps, and I remember the old adage, when my mother and my dad came to the UK, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. I mean, it was a well-trodden thing. It used to be on the windows of properties when you went to go and find rent. But in 2023, there was a report called the Generation Rent Report, where there were 200 rooms for let online, and they created 2 avatars. One is a black female, age 26, as a professional, and a white female avatar, 26, and professional. And they applied for vacancies for rooms or flats or apartments. And 36% of the applications that came back for the black female, who were made up from artificial intelligence, were negative responses. So race is still very insidious in society. It's there. It may not be as egregiously out there in terms of putting on the front door or front window of someone's house, but it's there in society. It's there in the workplace, and the data tells us that. So we have a real challenge in this country still, and in America, and some westernized societies. There's a real disconnect between what people are purporting that they want to do. Whilst like we describe it as Black History Month, I'm not an advocate of Black History Month, but it is what it is, because our history doesn't just resonate in one month, right? So,
and
we think,
keep talking. Go, sir. Yeah.
But the reality is still there. The stark reality is that there's such real challenges, and people celebrate those. We're celebrating Black History Month. We're put on events, we're put on awards, we're put on celebrations. But when you go into their organizations, you ask them to look at their numbers and see where their senior managers. And I don't believe you should just give people a job for the sake of giving people jobs. I don't believe in that. But I think that you should give people the opportunity to have access to the talent which is there. And what we do know, when you give, and McGregor said it, she said, where Black and Asian people are given opportunities, organizations perform better than had they not been in part of that organization. So for me, there's a good business case, apart from being morally the right thing to do, sensibly, a strategic, but actually it's good for your business. But you need to open up and make sure that the playing field is as level as you can possibly make it. That's how I see it. But there's a real disconnect. And then I think a lot of organizations are they're performative and not intentional.
Yeah. Let me go to Professor Les Henry, born in London, Borough of Lewisham, lectures in area of criminology, sociology, anthropology, Black history, whiteness studies, race, education, ethnicity, gender. Professor, in your studies, because one of the points which I flagged up was in your studies in respect of this. Experience organizational dynamics around it. What, in your opinion, is one of the biggest misconception companies have when addressing racial diversity?
When you say like one of the biggest misconceptions, in the context of what?
Well, when I listened to Dr. Carlton Browm a while ago, and when he says that in the office space or so, you will have in a sense, like the tick box exercise, you have the events for Black History Month or so, but it's a bigger issue, isn't it? In addressing the misconception around companies, around organizations, around even colleges or so, in addressing racial diversity based on your studies.
Right. So first thing, and Brother Carlton said something interesting, because he said there are 500 professors. And to my knowledge, there is something like under 160 chaired and tenured professors, because there's one bag of people out there with honorary doctorates and honorary professors, and they are not, most of them, worth the salt in my spit. And I want to be clear on that.
Doctors, I must say.
No, and the reason why I say that is because this is another one of these misconceptions about equity. Because oftentimes they will get these people to go and represent us, the collective, we as African Caribbeans. And oftentimes they are just there to appease. So if you want, so based on my own research, most of the research I've done around it has been within the context of academia. Okay. I've also done training for major organizations, LinkedIn, Sainsbury's, National Health Service, Bernardo's, for almost 3 decades, you might as well say. But for me, one of the biggest misconceptions, and Brother Carlton kind of flagged it up already, is that these organizations want equity. They don't want equity. And I know that this notion of the more diverse a business is the more, what's the word? It's going to be profitable. Let's say. They know this. I've been reading this stuff from I don't even know how long. What I think is a concern for me, and I'll speak in the context of academia. Okay, so right now where I am at the University of West London, there is not one Black academic in the Vice Chancellor Executive. This is my 11th year at University of West London. Not one. So what I'm saying is, in any position in the Vice Chancellor Executive, I'm talking about in the context of academics, there isn't one. Now, I've pointed this out. It's already in the public arena, so it's fine. But here's the rub. If you look at the student demographic for University of West London, they have something like 55 to 60% Black and Asian students across the board. So that's not reflected in the VCE. When you drill down into some of the schools, for instance, when I was in criminology, I was the only Black PhD teaching criminology. A really good friend of mine, wonderful brother, he had a master's, he was teaching. I know he was going to pursue his PhD, but the point I'm making is this. To my knowledge, okay, in the 7 years I was in the criminology team. I was the only black PhD. Now, Brother Carlton mentioned about the number of black PhD and how it doesn't really equivocate to professors. Well, there's many reasons for that, and I'll do this very quickly. First one is they will exclude you from interviews. I've witnessed this where I'm working now and where I've been working before. So they will exclude you from interview because if you get an interview, you have a chance to secure in a position. So you don't make the shortlist. That's the first way. Secondly, just like myself, when you often do achieve a position, you are either on a 0.5 contract, okay, as a lecturer. Now, on a 0.5 contract as a lecturer, you got to work pretty hard to ever become a senior lecturer because you're not going to put in the qualitative hours you need to progress. So these things, what they do is, for me, they are deliberate and they are willful. And I'll be really honest with you, I have got no time to think about misconceptions. These are not misconceptions. These are deliberate. And sometimes white racists and their organizations will put profit second to ensure that their whiteness and privileged positions are maintained. So that's my start on that. And my point, my perspective on that, and I'm unequivocal on that. And I've done research on that, and I can evidence that. Because, for instance, you can have these little tick box exercises. Oh yeah, we're gonna increase equality, equity, diversity. In fact, in an article that I wrote for our wonderful brother, Dr. Dave Thomas and Prof. Jason Arday, I've got an article in one of their books looking at whiteness in academia. And one of the things that came out in one of the interviews from more than one of the people I reasoned with was the fact that universities will bend over backwards for black students, but they don't do it for staff because they know the students are only there for a finite time. They're there for 3 years or 4 years, then they're gone. The staff are often there in exactly the same position, and they absolutely privilege white colleagues over black ones in HE in the UK. 100%.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And very, very inspiring right there. Nicola. Nicola is the founder of FP Cam's award-winning London-based boutique PR agency, being responsible for creating public relations and marketing strategies, social media. I'm glad I brought you in, Nicola, to come from your angle and your input into this sort of discussion. What's your take on this? Not the misconception, but the deliberate aspect of things.
In what terms? What Dr. Carlton and Professor Les just spoke about?
Yes, because we're talking about the organizations and we're talking about the structure. We're talking about these companies, and right there, they need PR. When it comes on to, especially even like Black History Month or so. How do you see that as yourself as well? In companies, yes.
Okay, so I will definitely come from the point of view from comms, right, and journalism and public relations, because that's my area of expertise. That's where I've been doing my work for over 17 years. And over the years, what I have seen, there is a transition from what I would classify as blatant marginalization of voices in regards to stories. And now we have coverage of successful Black business owners or people doing well, but they're always placed in the paradigm or almost like a wolf whistle, a dog whistle, if you want, in a negative trope or negative couching. And I always quote Dr. Maya Angelou when she speaks about the power of words, and she talks about one time at one stage in life we'll be able to actually, like Dr. Carlton says, data is important. We'll be able to measure the power of words. And I firmly believe that what we have now is kind of like an intellectual marginalization of business owners, because again, I speak in that space when it comes to when we're talking about the promotion of Black economics and Black businesses. And a classic example of that would be something that I've seen happen recently, where you've got a specific person who is now #1 on the power list. And when he was a younger person, he was homeless. And the whole journey of the article celebrating his position as #1 in the power list is couched in this homelessness. So what does that really do? It's a dog whistle of where are we positioning these successful Black people, quote unquote Black people, in the spaces of economic growth. It's a reminder of positioning, and it's a reminder of letting other people know that actually those that are, building businesses, you are often placed in isolation, fear, sometimes lack of trust. And then when you have these messaging going out to you on a regular basis, you lose that confidence, but you also lose the ability to grow successful businesses because you're not going to reach out to anyone else. You're not going to be positioning yourself in a place where you're likely to fail. And just to underpin that point, I was watching a film the other day, and it's a woman, and she was talking about her position in politics, and how the journalist couched her was, she's a real life Cinderella. Now let's position that. What is that really saying to the audience? Well, they're identifying, without saying she's a woman, that she's this soft thing that really hasn't got the nous to run politics, right? So again, it's about phrasing things and then positioning people so that subliminally you know where you're positioned, but also the audience knows where you're positioned. So you don't have to say, oh, this is a Black person that's pulled himself up by the bootstraps. What you just say is that this urbanite or this person from this urban area, and that couches it in a very specific framing, which then you internalize, and then you don't go out and reach out to the banks. You don't go and do all the things that are needed for us to progress and get that economic equality. So I can only speak from comms, but that's how I see it.
One of the things also, and I'll come back to Dr. Browm, we often see organizations, like they're rolling out diversity initiatives in response to public pressure. I'll put this out there to yourself and also Professor Henry. Is there public pressure and in response to the lack of the diversity and the lack of moving away from the misconception to the deliberate factor? And why do we think these initiatives often fail to create lasting change? And I put in this other bit, or do they? Is it? Sorry.
No, I think it's really interesting point you're making. But when I talk about organizations, it's organizations plural. Whether you're commercially for profit or not for profit, it doesn't matter, because the structures and people talk about systemic and structural systems. They are systems and structures that are in place that often prevent progress. So let me give you a few examples of this, right? So if I want to, let's say on a business landscape, I want to go in to do a business, and I want to go and loan some money to grow and invest in a business. If I go to a bank and I said, I'd like to borrow some money, this is the business, here's a business plan, etc. Can you lend me some money against the idea that this is what I expect to achieve? And yes, I'm going to put some money into the business as collateral. Now, if you look at the structures, I took about the system. So Black and African Caribbean, Bangladeshi, Asian people are likely to earn less money for the first and foremost, right? So there's a disparity in a pay gap. We are less likely to own assets. 24% of African Caribbean people own assets in the UK today. So if the bank person I'm going to speak to taps in a model, an equation that says you're never going to get that money. You're just never going to get the money because the equation don't add up. Now, so what I have to then do is find a different source of lending, which is often significantly more expensive to service. So it becomes a constraint to that business to start with to grow their business because they have to service the debt. So that's just one area as a good example of that, right? A structure or a system. Prof Les talked about interviews. I know that if my name is Khan or Mohammed, peace be upon his name, if I go in that with that name, we know that we have a less chance of getting access to an interview for a decent job. Now, Prof Les talked about the interview process, and I can't remember if he talked. In fact, I think, Prof, there was 23. I looked at some data. There was 23,000 university professors in the UK. 23,000 is a big number, but I don't know what the number of black PhDs are. But I'm sure that some of them are more than capable, without any shadow of a doubt, of being in more senior roles, or people which are currently PhDs who don't have access to that. So I describe the race paradox as what I call this unconscious illusion of inclusion. They put systems in place. There are organizations, and I've got to be fair, and I've got to be balanced in my arguments here, right? There are some companies who are genuinely trying to be intentional, but there's a significant disproportionate amount which are not. And we can look at through the data, the lens of the data, because that doesn't lie to us. You can say, well, how many senior leaders do you have in the FTSE 100? 0. How many black directors do you have? Very few. In 2017, 2021, the John Parker Review said we must have more black senior directors to make better decisions within our organizations. So it's telling us this, right? They have unconscious bias training and things like this to say, well, I think education is important, and I think education is one of the ways that you can help. But despite that, we had, I think her name was Esther McVeigh, just said in 2023 that anything to do with DE&I in the civil service, we must stop. It's because we think that these any jobs in this area is considered too woke. Now, they've corrupted the terminology of woke, because we understand that woke in the 1970s was an activist word of actually, are you down for the cause, right? And if you think there's a track by Erykah Badu back in the day called My Master's Teacher, what speaks to that, about being woke. What woke is about activism, but she said, I want to delete all jobs because they don't see it as important. So there's embedded cultural norms within organizations, and a culture, according to Hofstede, says it's the collective programming of the mind. So I think organizations are often programmed and conditioned. And then what you then have in the boardroom, you have this thing called confirmation bias. You know what? I see these people. We've had one before. He wasn't very good. Therefore, you know what? I'm not going to recruit anymore.
Exactly.
That person, so there's all of these things. It's not just one individual aspect. It's a series of different connected things that come together that play a role in keeping people in a particular position. And at the end of the day as well, why would you want to concede power?
See it there?
Professor, if you want to come in there before I ask another question there.
Yeah, just very quickly, because Brother Carlton, I don't know, probably you haven't heard me play it, but woke has been used in African-American communities for over 100 years. They've used it. And the first documented case, because when all this woke business I actually did a lecture on that. Well, I dealt with aspects of it. There's a case called the Scottsboro Boys in America, where there were some black boys taking a train. They ended up cavorting with some white women. This was in 1932. Okay. And then what happened was, because they weren't supposed to be cavorting with these white women, they stopped in some redneck cracker town and they got arrested. And one of the major advocates who got them out of prison was a famous musician, Leadbelly. And he wrote a song called the Scottsboro Boys. Everybody who's listening to this, go on YouTube and just put in Leadbelly interview around the Scottsboro Boys. And the last thing he says is, when we are in these areas, we got to stay woke. We got to be aware of where we are. That's what woke is.
So the term woke at that time was being aware, being conscious.
That's exactly what it means. It means to remain circumspect. That's what it means. But just like everything else, because it's a case of what we call hegemony. So people will take an idea from the bottom, act like it's theirs, corrupt it, and give it back to people. So, oh, you're so woke. You want this, you want that. It's just like this, and I will call her that. Kemi Badenoch, to me, is a half idiot. In fact, she's a full idiot. Her. And I can easily evidence that because the stuff she says makes no sense whatsoever. So when she talks about things like reparative justice or critical race theory, you can't teach critical race theory. If you teach white privilege, it's illegal. These are the things that came out of this person's mouth. And then the latest thing someone sent me the other day, I could only last about 30 seconds because I believe it was her. I think it was her, but it doesn't matter because there's whole heap of them out there. And they basically said, countries are falsely claiming for reparative justice when they have no right to do so. Now, this is a black person saying this. Yeah. Now, one of the things people who know me know, I am 100% against any kind of memorial. I think it's a complete waste of money. So I'm interested in raising the anchor for the Windrush, which actually was a Nazi troop ship that was used to take Jews to some of the death camps. People don't know this. When it was the Monte Rosa, okay, Prof. Gus deals with this in his book, you know, Don't Raise the Windrush or whatever it's called. But here's the crucial point that I'm making here, okay? You've got these people advocating for memorials. And I have been included in many of those discussions for over 2 decades. And do you know why my name never appears at the end? Because I asked them one crucial question. My parents are Jamaican. I describe myself as Southeast London, Jamaican, African. That's what I am. William Alistair Anthony Henry is not an African name. So something was done to me and people who look like me for me to manifest in this time and this place with that name. So what more memorials do I need to have to remind me that something was done to people like me, why I've ended up in this place as part of the African Caribbean diaspora? And for me, these are the crucial conversations we really need to have, because the people who supposedly represent us don't. Most of them, and I don't call them sellouts. I think that's another major mistake we make, because to sell out, you have to buy in. So before you tell me they're a sellout, you show me where they bought into our narrative, because they don't.
You know, I was mooting to Nicola and Dr. Carlton Browm, so I need to ask the question about reparation at some point. But you just brought it up a while ago, and you realize that. I'll give you an example. I typed in on TikTok the other day a clip of a show that I did, and I typed hashtag slave trade. I just put slave trade there, and TikTok said I violated their community guidelines by putting the word slave trade.
Well, you would.
You know, so the whole aspect of this whole thing now is that it's like it's coming from all different quarters. No one wants to say apologize for the transatlantic slave trade. And I believe, Professor, you have a term which you want to say.
Well, to be honest, I've stopped. You will see slave trade in some of my writing, but I'm unequivocal, and I call it African chattel enslavement.
Yes.
So on the now defunct course that myself and my wonderful colleagues created called Global Black Studies, Decolonization and Social Justice, we used the terminology African chattel enslavement. It was not a trade. When as Africans did we say we're going to trade ourselves with these demonic people? Because that's what the white racists are. I am not saying all white people are racist, but the ones who are racist are unequivocal in that. They know exactly what it is they're doing. As Malcolm X said, you know, they're experts at it. So why do we think they're not? They know exactly what they're doing, which is why they continue to do it. So I call it African chattel enslavement, not slavery or slave trade, because that's not what it was. And the last point I'm going to make is I used to teach so-called slavery at Goldsmiths College when I was there until I left in 2005. And if you meet any of my students, they will tell you that I 100% proved that what happened to us as Africans is totally unique in the human experience. And there's a book called Crossing the Danger Water. And there's a wonderful essay in there where they say, basically, No other members of the family, of the human family, have ever been reduced to a mathematical equation. Because in America, some say for some voting rights or whatever, we were 3/5 of a human being. What this means is, in a war situation, for every 5 deaths of people of African ancestry, only 3 are recorded. And anyone who's listening to this, you can check it out yourself. It's not hidden, it's out there. No other members of the human family have been reduced to a mathematical equation.
Yeah.
Jamaican sociologist Orlando Patterson called it uniquely natal alienation. Because if you are an enslaved person, usually your child, if you're a woman and you're pregnant, belongs to you. For us as peoples of African ancestry, especially on seasoning islands like Jamaica, because a lot of people think they used to transport slaves to Jamaica. Not in the first instance, it was a seasoning and a breaking island, like some of the other islands. So my point is this: when we talk about African chattel enslavement, let's not confuse it, because you will see how the contemporary narratives go. Oh yeah, there's all this slavery here and blah, blah, blah. Don't get me wrong, I'm not minimalizing human suffering. But let's be very clear that what happened to us as Africans is totally unique.
Yeah, and I would agree. And Silver, I think just picking up on that particular point, just to bring it back from what Prof. Les has just said. Now, I start the book in terms of the race paradox, and I said, well, why are we in this situation? What is it in the psyche of people? And it actually it goes back to history, how we were perceived historically and subsequently intergenerationally. And that's what happens, is how you are viewed, when someone does not, sees you as something, as a chattel, and someone who's not worth anything. In fact, you're a commodity. That's effectively what you are, at the behest of someone else. But intergenerationally over time, so when you think about society as a whole, I mean, 1963, I had a conversation, I was at a seminar this week and in Wales, and actually sharing insights about their own history, which a lot of people weren't even aware of. But the point I was trying to make was this: in 1963, just down the road from South Wales in Bristol, there was a bus boycott. Roy Hackett and Prince Browm, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And they couldn't get jobs on the buses. But people were thinking about Rosa Parks in America. So the point I was making, how you were perceived back even 1963 about who you were in terms of the stereotypes and tropes that were levied as being lazy. And I remember, I think it was famously, and I don't want to quote him incorrectly, but I think it was Ron Atkinson back in the days, they used to say about black footballers.
Ron Nodes, Crystal Palace chairman.
Right. But there was suggestions and tropes and stereotypes. Black players were lazy. They wouldn't play in the cold, as an example. And now, today, 36% of the Premiership players are black. So what I'm saying, these perceptions of who we were, lazy, unintelligent, all of these things were part of the psyche. And I think what happens over time, those things are transferred and they're still present. So why do I want to pay someone who's all I think about is good enough to just be a cleaner? And I remember speaking to Prof. Les many years ago, and he said to me, I ended up going to a conference in, I think it was Birmingham you were going to, you pulled up in a car park and you were trying to go into the car park, and the guy said, no, you can't come around here. And he was actually the keynote speaker. I'll never forget that. You were the keynote speaker.
That was a hospital in Nottingham. It was University of Nottingham, I think it was, or something like that. But you're right about Ron Atkinson. He called Marcel Desailly a lazy thick nigger. That's what he called him.
So what we're saying?
Yes, go on.
What we're saying then, it's institutionally intrinsically linked. The whole factor, the whole racism factor. Then let's call it what it is. Then.
But hold on a minute. I mean, it's not only just linked through the institution, but it's linked also, through my point of view, controlling the narrative. controlling the story in a way that suits the people that are programming. So you just gave a good example when you say you were, searching, you put the word slave trade. Someone is controlling those programs that defines what that is, right? So we do the conference, the Black Business Entrepreneurs Conference, and we did a opening scene, and the person that was creating the opening scene typed in the word yam, and they couldn't find yam through AI. It was yam, wasn't it, Dr. Carlton?
Yes, right. Yeah, it was yam.
Yeah, through AI searching. So the question is, does yam exist or doesn't it exist? Well, it depends on who's programming the system that says what that is or what that isn't. So when we're talking about also the institution, is who's telling our stories? Who is then laying down those footprints that says, okay, this is the journey from woke in 1930s to woke today, and this is how it really lives in our existence in the 21st century, so that our children can understand. And we know that actually, when you're looking at controlling communities and controlling movements, Twitter is a good example of that. When you're looking at really mobilizing people, the communities that are built with a real clear understanding of the mission, with the language they use, they mobilize rather quickly. Whereas if it's fragmented, because on one side you call it yam, the other side you call it dashin, then it's fragmented all over the place. It's about controlling that, because we decide what the story is for us. This is why books like this is so important. So that it is a real holistic view across everything that we're talking about today, but then trusting each other to say, this is the direction, or these are the directions we need to be going in. These are the things that we need to be thinking of. It doesn't have to be all of us thinking homogenously
Homogenously.
Yeah, thank you. The same. But there is a trust understanding between us that says, actually, for the greater good, these are our common goals. These are our common understandings of each other, and having a very clear consensus that, right, these are the things we're going to do. This is why I'm enjoying this conversation, because there's a clear consensus that however we're going to cut this cake, it's going to be cut, and we're going to go down the same direction to our freedom. That's what I say.
But here's the thing, though. Because I'm a pragmatist, right? And I know Prof. Les always calls it. Is it transcendental? I can't remember your word you used.
Yeah, I'm into I'm transcendental, mate.
But it has to be transformational. It has to be transformational, right? And I think the same is true with organizations, because whilst we can recognize and understand what the challenges currently are and have been and still exist and will exist into the future, how do we change that? And I'm talking specifically about organizations. I describe these organizations into 4 quadrants, and I think there are those organizations that are walking the walk. There are those what I describe as cultural laggards. They're not going to change anything unless the policy or the law dictates to them, and if they don't do it, something happens seriously enough for them to want to change. There are those I describe as beacons of change, and those I call who are in the paradox, which is high on talk but low on walk. And I think a lot of companies, lots of organizations live in that space. And what I mean by that, Sylvan, is look, the Black History Month thing, the Women's International Month thing, all of these things, there's advertising going on, etc. Now, I remember reading a scholar when I was doing this book. Can an individual have two opposite juxtaposed views of the world and they coexist? And he said the answer is yes to that. So in other words, if I have particular racist values or beliefs or biases, but when I walk into my workplace tomorrow morning and it says I must act and behave like this in this organization because that's their values and beliefs, can I separate those two things? The answer is your views and your beliefs, your intrinsic values and beliefs, walk inside with you.
Absolutely.
So the consequence of that is when you have to make a decision in that boardroom or for a recruitment or for promotion, those values and beliefs are still sitting with you. And that's the challenge.
I want to ask this question, and we're now 2024, and there was a CRE, there was all of these different racial movements which happened. Dr. Browm, what is the solution in actually addressing this ill? Is it something that can be, because we're talking about this particular problem here now, and as Professor Les Henry break out the bigger picture, the bigger narrative, Nicola said what we speak, but is there any solution that can actually drive based on the laws that can deal with the whole aspect of inequality? I go back. I'll say one thing else again. There's a note here which was saying that Jamaican teachers in the UK are getting paid less than their colleagues in the UK as well. But everybody's sort of keeping quiet because they said it is much better to get paid here than in Jamaica. So there's a silence there. It's like people are accepting things in a way.
Look, there are the Equalities Act of 2010 exists. It has existed for a long time. The Race Equalities Act in 1965 was changed to try and change, but it hasn't significantly changed the narrative, right? We still have these inherent disparities. So having laws, I think, is important. Don't take me wrong, but it's not the laws per se but it's the people who are leading those organizations that have to make changes. And I think, people talk about representation. I think representation really does matter, genuinely matters. But when you have that opportunity and you're in that room, do you actually make a difference? Because the risk is sometimes we pull the ladder up behind us when we get into that particular room, and we don't use the currency that we actually have. Because I'm in a good position now. Maybe I don't want to say anything. Maybe I don't want to upset the apple cart. And I think there was a guy in 1972. His name was Ivan Yanis. Talked about group thinking over a period of time. What happens? You get into a space, and because me and Pref get on, and I don't want to upset him when I'm in a meeting. I get on with this guy, and I get on with Sue, and I get on with Sister Nicola, and let's just go along to get along. And that's what often happens. So we don't want to be that descending voice. So I think you have to have allies, you have to have partners. Yes, education is part of it, policy is part of it, legislation. I don't think you can say it's one single thing, because we know over the years one single thing hasn't helped in isolation. Yes, I mean, in 2015, Theresa May said, look, we have to have the diversity pay gap, gender pay gap, sorry, if you're an organization over 250 employees. And you have to monitor that and measure that. And I think measurement is really important, because that's the only way you can tangibly see, have we made a difference? And you can see now the progress of those organizations on gender. Now, I think I genuinely believe you should do the same thing on race, because there's an old adage what says what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So if you measure stuff, you can say, well, you know what, we've got this level of senior leaders coming through in our organization. And the Parker Review agreed with that in 2017. They said we need to measure the growth of directors in Britain PLC, because that's the only way we're going to see a tangible difference. So I think measurement is part of it. I think policy is part of it. I think culture, organization, I think leadership is a key part of this whole equation. If leaders do not decide to change, whatever you decide, you and I can have this, we can have this big discussion today, but until someone makes a tangible decision and says, listen, this is what we need to do, and I'm going to follow this through, and I'm going to make sure that this is how we change, it doesn't happen.
Let's stick a pin right there, because I was going to ask this question. How do you think...
I'd like to say one thing very quickly, because I think a little dangerous narrative has surfaced.
If it's in right there with Dr. Browm, how do you think leadership attitudes toward race impact the success or failure of an organization diversity efforts? I just want to say, I was about to ask that question there. It fits in right what you're saying there, Dr. Browm, and then we can go over to Dr. Les. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to say one thing very quickly, and then, I'm fine. Yeah. When you said Jamaicans, we need to be very careful about these kind of closed, myopic ways of addressing certain situations, because it is not Jamaicans. And as Jamaicans, we're used to being reduced to things like yardies, remember, then everybody's a yardie. But the most important thing is, it is not Jamaican teachers who are being targeted. It's Black teachers who get paid less. This happens in academia. And again, in the article I wrote and published for Dave Thomas and Jason Arday, I pointed out exactly how it works. Because I can be employed as a professor, and a colleague of mine can be employed as a professor at the same time. It's incremental. I would bet that I'm on the lower scale of the increments than my white colleagues. That's how it works. That's how it works through gender. That's how it works through class. And that is how it works through race. And I think we need to avoid these kind of things like Jamaicanizing stuff, because then we get lost in that wash that other black teachers are getting equitable treatment. So that's the only thing I was going to say.
Professor, sorry, Dr. Browm, Houston, there's a problem, and we're going to have a discussion on your book, but it has opened up a massive can of worms, Nicola.
Our next one with Brother Carlton. Yeah.
And the thing I always say all the while is that I just don't like having these discussions. Just talk. But we got to have some solution, Dr. Browm, Nicola, as to how to fix this thing, because there's a point which I wanted to raise, and the point was, then what advice would you give employees of color who feel stuck in an organization that claims to value diversity, but they're stuck? What do we say?
Sorry, Nicola, go on.
Can I just say, listen, I mean, there are some fundamental things, even like the conference report that Dr. Browm wrote in 2021, looking at trust, right? One of the areas that we fundamentally need to have is that level of trust. So when you speak about the lack of transparency of pay, it is about having those real deliberate conversations with each other. I know, for example, one of the things that we do a lot of work around is about speakers, getting speakers on the rotation to be able to speak at different events and circuits, and constantly, like you do with Black History Month, and every single time that you've got a black speaker out there, there's never a budget. Well, actually, let's just start doing a thing of putting down that line and saying, actually, no black speaker will ever speak at any event for free, period, point blank. And I know that there are certain skills, careers, where there is an understanding amongst black women, for instance, that are acting, and they said, right, if a director comes to us for a role, they've gone to that one actress and she says, no, I'm not going to take that role because it's under my value, and they go to the second one, she speaks to the first one, and there's an understanding in that ecosystem of how no one will take the role until they go back to the first one and give her exactly what she demanded above and beyond. And that has to be something that we conscientiously have to do amongst us. And for that reason, I do things like work with Black Comms Network, which is about 140 Black communication professionals, PR professionals that work across the sector. There's no lack of transparency in that group, as far as I'm aware. Well, that's not how I act. Also work with We Are Black Journos. Again, what's the pay scale for these Black journalists? There's another organization called Journo Resources, which is predominantly white. So matching them together and saying, well, what's this one's being paid over what this one's being paid? Absolutely. Why they're not being paid exactly the same? Again, Black content creators, they're being offered products to promote, whereas their white equivalent is being offered £1,500, £2,000 for a tweet. Why aren't we very clear that actually L'Oreal or Shea Moisture cannot go to a Black content creator and just give them products? So trust and transparency, for me, is the solution. It's definitely one of the solutions out there for us to be able to say, actually, if one of us don't eat, none of us eat. And if one of us eats, all of us eat. For me, it's from my position as a comms person, that's my responsibility. So no speaker in my roster ever goes out to speak to anyone for less than 1,500, period, point blank. You cannot come to them without that being, unless my client says it's an opportunity I want to take, that's their choice. But as a standard, let's start that process of being transparent of pay. That for me is a beginning point.
Absolutely.
So Nicola, you make a really valid point there, Nicola. And I think there's 3 points I just want to quickly make. But one that speaks to what Nicola just said is about value, right? First, we have to value ourselves.
Absolutely.
And so when you said, actually, we don't have choices, we do have choices. Now, remember this, right? So when there's lots of studies out there, but there's one what always resonates with me, and I remember writing this in the book. When you're Black and African and ethnic minority, you're 8 to 12% more likely to be more innovative and creative than any other demographic group. Now, what does that mean in a commercial sense, right? Today, we think about AI, we think about all of this new technologies. So it could be literature, it could be art, it could be whatever. If we're going to be more creative, that gives companies what they look for is a competitive advantage. So if your company can create that competitive advantage by employing people to be who are 8 to 12% more likely to be creative and give you products or services that can help your organization, that's a big deal. So remember, I think you have to remember your value in the first instance.
Absolutely.
That's the first point I wish to make. And you still have a choice. There, ultimately, even if you decide to leave, there are still other opportunities. If you're good at what you do, there are opportunities, and someone will pay you your value. But you must value yourself in the first place, and that's something I've learned over time. And a guy I studied with back in the day said to me, Carlton, I remember I was sitting on these executive boards, and I was speaking to this lady, and he said, "Look, I'm on this gig, and it's really good as this non-exec." And he was getting X amount of Ks per day. And then he realized when he was having this off-the-cuff coffee conversation that she was getting paid twice he was getting paid. And we're talking serious amounts of money.
Yeah.
From that moment onwards, he's never ever charged below a particular level because he recognized that his value was actually significantly more than the individual. So that's the first thing. The second thing, so value yourself and remember that you do have value to yourself and to other organization. And the other thing I think we have to be really careful about, and Nicola will know this about me, I'm not a big fan of lots of award ceremonies because I think you're shooting, what are we celebrating when the data still tells us today that we are significantly behind the 8 ball, as they describe it in America. And we're celebrating, we go to all of these congratulatory and celebratory events, and the real structures and systems still haven't benefited Black and African Caribbean diaspora in this country. I think we have to be really careful about celebrating this stuff. Yes, we have to acknowledge that if your people are making progress, that's fine. There's not an issue with that. But we're putting on tens of thousands of pounds worth of recognition stuff. And organizations are getting this false sense of actually we're moving forward. And actually it goes back to what I said at the very beginning, that there's this unconscious illusion of inclusion. We get this award saying we're doing really well. And we start to believe our own publicity. And that's really dangerous if we're not careful, because every year we go to these awards, we picked up this award, look, we're doing well.
Yes.
But when I still ask you about your senior leadership team, it's still devoid of people that look like us. So that's what I would say. I would be very conscious of that.
But can I just ask a question? Is there an example of any organization that you believe maybe have successfully addressed this issue? And what did they do different? Is there any company, any organization, any sort of business or so, Black, white, what? Is there an example, Dr. Browm?
Can I just...
Professor Henry, Nicola,
Yeah, can
I don't know any, so I can't even comment.
Okay, I can give you one example. Nicola, I can give you. Go on, Nicola. You want to take this one? I can go back. I can give you one example as well. Go on.
Well, I wasn't going to give an example of an organization. I was just going to give an example of where it has worked successfully. But you go first with your example of organization, and then I can come after you.
Well, I don't know currently today how it stands. The same organization looks currently, but I can only talk about this in context of gender. Okay. Now, Vodafone several years ago made a decision to recruit more females, and they got to the stage where 50% of their senior leadership team became females. So they made an intentional decision that they wanted to recruit more people, not for the sake of ticking a box, but what they decided, we want to have more female candidates. And as a consequence of that, I think someone said it earlier, I think it was Prof. Les, I think said it earlier, if you're on the candidate list by definition, and you've got an overwhelming number of people on the candidate list, the chances of recruitment were greater. And I think that's what they did. But also that correlated with their performance also improved significantly. So what we do know, when you have more, going back to what I said earlier, when you have more diverse people in the boardroom, overall, the performance improves. So Vodafone was the example I was going to give you, but that was on gender, not necessarily on race.
I was just thinking about Blair Bailey a while ago when he mentioned the woman, Tony Blair, the only woman that came in as MPs.
Well, I was going to piggyback on that, actually. I was going to mention women, to be totally honest with you. And I was going to say, actually, with you got the increase of entrepreneurship, about 58% increase in entrepreneurship are women that's coming through the ranks. And what I was going to say was, myself personally, is what you're seeing is there are far more women now having the courage to really just step out there and make things happen for themselves in one way or the other where it comes to business. And I can speak personally on from my own individual perspective, which is I'm in a room here with Dr. Carlton Browm, who I reached out to in 2020 when just before he wrote the report, and I was asking his advice, and he became my mentor. And that has helped me to see incremental, like massive incremental growth in my business, which now leads me to have a connection with Professor Les, who's now encouraging me in different ways. It's about having that courage as well to step into these places and say, actually, I belong here, and ask those really quite, as a woman sometimes, and I'm going to be broad speaking with this, but as a woman, can be quite daunting when you're taught to be demure and quiet and know your place. And you're just saying, actually, I need to survive and I need to grow successful businesses for future generations to come. So for me, I don't need an organization, because it's becoming a living, breathing thing in our ecosystem of women definitely stepping up and saying, this is what I want, this is what I need to do, and who do I need to reach out to help me to get there. And I'm an example of that in the flesh.
So, Silver, just speaking to that point, right, about organizations being successful, I could give you a different perspective on supply chain as an example. Now, you may know the organization, the company called Target in America. Now, they have 6,000. I mean, one of the challenges getting on a supply chain as an entrepreneur, if you want to grow your business, you want to, potentially get into bigger accounts, like a supermarket or a retail chain or a big corporate, and supply them, because that kind of, if I'm an engineer and I can get a contract to do maintenance of 10 buildings, and they're all 100 grand a year each, that's $500,000 for me, or 200 grand a piece, that's healthy. But to get access is a bit difficult, and for the reasons we've described earlier. Now, Target, as a good example, they've now got 6,000 diverse suppliers, 6,000, and they make a point of having diverse suppliers, even though it's more complicated. Is that you've got more invoices, you've got more administration, etc. But when the suppliers they've now managed to grow their businesses exponentially. Now, I remember speaking to a lady called Nidra Dixon from Accenture, who's a global supplier diversity lead. And she was talking about, and I'm listening to her speak, she's talking about having small suppliers come in, African Americans coming into their supply chain, and they gave them a small opportunity, got them to prove themselves, and now these businesses are turning over multi-millions of pounds. But it took someone at the very beginning to say, we're going to give you that opportunity, and look at how you not circumvent per se, but look at an opportunity and say, look, you may not be ready for this big opportunity, but I can give you that piece here. And then you can go and demo, and not only what they did with that, they supported that business through mentorship, guidance, and education until they were able to have the capacity to grow. And now that business 10 years on is now here.
Yes.
And they have to, what I'm saying, there are different ways. It's not just a singular thing. And when we think about recruitment, going back to Prof. Les's idea again, about who's on the short list, over time. And then you can start to generate opportunities for people, whether that's for recruitment, whether that's for promotions, whether that's training, whether that's access to finance, or give them opportunities in the supply chain. But you have to be intentional. And there are some people doing it right now. There's far too many not doing it, or attempting to do it and not doing it particularly well. But they need that guidance and that support to get them over the hurdles, as it were.
We've got a few minutes to wrap up, but Dr. Browm, where can people get your book now, The RaceParadox? Why organizations fail on race?
Well, it's on pre-order at the moment. It's on. You can go to Amazon and you get it. The RaceParadox, Why Organizers Fail on Race, is on Amazon as we speak.
Because and that link is there as well, where people can actually even aspire consultancy. They can also see the link there as well.
Yeah, you can go to or you could go onto the Black Business Entrepreneur Conference. It's called the website is theBBEC.com.
Yes.
Which is the Black Entrepreneur Business Conference, and there's a link on the website there, so people can go directly and pick it up.
Well, I was just trying to find some little content for my to showcase Black History Month, and the topic, Professor Les Henry, was not Black History Month. It is Black History. That's how I actually had coined. As you can see right there, it says Black History, and as a result of that, it's going to continue beyond October. I'm specifically going to make sure it continues beyond October. But I want to thank you so much, guys, for coming on and sort of opening up this issue. Professor Henry, what's your last word for the time being?
Right. So for me, just a couple of things. One, I'm not into resistance. I'm into transcendence. Because if we were not transcendental people as peoples of African ancestry, we would not be having this conversation. The white world did not intend, the white racists who mold and shape this. Some people say racism is thousands of years old. Good luck to them. To me, the way it's been mobilized against us is probably about 500 years. And I know, for instance,
just one second. Dr. Browm, can you send me the website and I just put the thing up? You WhatsApp it to me. Sorry, keep talking, Professor. Anyway, my apologies.
So, you know, there's a wonderful brother I do a lot of work with called Brother Hakeem. We do film breakdowns. Well, he got me into it. And one of them we do is on blacks in sci-fi. I'm really into sci-fi and stuff like that. And if you want to see what your future looks like, look at science fiction films. There were hardly any black people in science fiction films up to the 1950s, 60s, because they did not see us in their future. So to me, we have to appreciate what our ancestors have been through and how they drive us forward. Like Sankofa, look behind you. You might need it. Go back and fetch it. That's one thing. So I am transcendental. I really don't care what white people want to do anymore. You know, I've stopped caring about them because their system is set up to privilege them. If they are clever enough to invest in it, fine. If they're not, fine. I'm into transcendence. So this is what it is. And I will try and find ways to circumnavigate that. That's the first thing. The second thing I would leave people with, there's a wonderful sister called Professor Marimba Annie. She wrote a brilliant book called Yorugu. And one of the things that Marimba Annie said, and I say it all the time, the only reason white people have power over us is because we continue to give it to them.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about breaking the mindset, like, you know, in Jamaica, we said Babylon released the chain, then I use them brain. We've got to start using ours to unshackle those mental chains. Because I think we're in the best historical moment now to transcend a lot of this stuff. And don't be too focused on this on the UK. Go to the continent, go to the Caribbean and see where your expertise can mix with the expertise in those places to create a brighter future. Not necessarily for us, but the generations who are following us. Because, look, last thing, if Europeans thought Africa was so backward, why the hell are they trying to get us out of it and they recolonize it? Because they know it's the least polluted, least populated continent on the planet. Africa is the global, the greatest amount of people under 30 is on the African continent. So why are we so willing to invest in places like this where they really don't want us? And that's what I believe. Our future is not here. Our future is not, and I'm not just talking for black people, I'm talking about human beings who recognize the commonality of our condition. Because if I was white and working class, I could share much of what I've shared today from a different perspective. Because I'm not in the history books. If I'm white working class, you tell me where they are.
Yes. And thank you for that. And thank you so much for coming on. And just the last word, and I'll ask the last words also, this particular question to Dr. Browm and to Nicola. The recent Commonwealth the UK wasn't so very keen, or they didn't want to put reparation on the book. And all of them across the board, right through, say no apologies, no reparation. What's your take on that, Professor? And are we supposed to just be begging them or demanding?
So you want the whole show to start again, Sylvan, on that question.
Yeah, here we have the question.
Listen,
just a start up on the next show we're gonna have. Professor, can you sum it up?
That is a whole big question, and it is. I can. Look, in a simple term, I believe. Do I believe in reparations? Do I think reparations are necessary? The answer to that question is yes. Do I think it should be given to respective governments just to use as they see fit? No. I think that we need, as someone who considers themselves British, Black, African, I am 35% Nigerian, 34% Ghanaian, and 8% Congolese. But I'm Jamaican. My heritage is Jamaican wholeheartedly.
Yes.
Would I give X amounts of billions or trillions of dollars to a president or a prime minister of a country? I would want to invest in education, systems, healthcare, infrastructure, so the country is set up for sustainability for the next 1,000 years. Yes. Because what's happened when you read the book, why they left Africa underdeveloped, they left it underdeveloped. Imagine Jamaica still doesn't have a train infrastructure, as an example. We shouldn't have that. So the question is simple for me. Yes, reparations are necessary, but B, how do we use that money is more of a bigger question for me.
But remember, it's reparative justice. It's not money. Money is a small part of it.
Yes. So.
Even the monetary of these Caribbean government, especially not Gaston Browm of Antigua and Barbuda.
We wouldn't give none of them nothing. Look how Jamaica was going to sell us out for $7 billion.
Well, Nicola Millington, last word.
Yeah, I agree that we should have reparations. I think it's too big a conversation to have in this last closing minutes. But what I would go back to is, what's the solutions, right? So from a comms point of view, my biggest thing at the moment is about how we are telling our stories and controlling those narratives for ourselves. And so not leaning into those negative tropes as much as possible. So for me, it's always about looking at the things that we do very well, highlighting them, celebrating them, uplifting them, and making sure that we recognize the value of those things so that when we are putting our products out, our stall out to the world, we are in a real tangible way that makes sense for our own survival. And the second thing is a holistic approach in regards to how we operate with each other. We don't have to operate in the same kind of paradigm that has existed. So quickly, Dr. Carlton spoke earlier on about how we approach banks and institutions for money. It's about recognizing that actually how we raise funds can be very, very different from how the institution sometimes presents it to us. So when we are talking to these big organizations for sponsorship and funding, letting them know and having real conversations that sometimes their language is just not appropriate. And if they want to get the information they want to measure it, however that measurement looks, they need to adjust it accordingly so they can also benefit from whatever that benefit is for them as well. Yeah. So having a holistic approach, because we are bringing something very different to the table when we are allowed to sit around this table, this metaphorical table that we have. So for me, I'll just repeat holistic approach and also about controlling our narratives. I don't need to know about how many bootstraps we've been pulled up by. My shoes are tight enough as it is. I'm doing a good job. You talk about it in the positive.
So Sylvan, one word for me, Sylvan, is simple as this. If nothing changes, nothing changes, right?
Absolutely.
So that's a simple thing. And I think we must take ownership and responsibility for ourselves. And that's a Garveyite philosophy for me. It's as simple as that, self-determination.
And it's so important because, we are seeing around us a lot of young people, a lot of children growing up and down, and we have a responsibility for them to nurture them and to education. And I believe this whole process of the whole educational discussions that I want to have, these are not sometimes sexy subjects or exciting subjects, but really dealing with some core issues and some core meat as well. Listen, I want to thank you guys, Professor Sir Henry, for coming on.
Yeah, well, give thanks on Brother Silborn. I enjoyed it. To Nicola,
yes,
and to Brother Carlton, Sis Nicola, respect. Yeah, I like this. It was good.
Yes, and Nicola, thank you so much for coming on. I know for years.
Nicola.
and Dr. Sir Carlton Browm, thank you so much for coming on. I don't know. Listen. At the end of the day, I can knight you. I can give you this, sir. I can do it. I'm from Ocho.
Yeah, just never knight me, man.
No.
I'd rather you call me Shifu or Senpai, but don't call me.
Let's forget the knight, the Chifu. Yeah.
Anyway, Silver, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a blessing to have to share the platform with Brother Les and Sister Nicola as well. So thank you.
Man, thanks. Honestly, stay blessed and I like the energy.
All the best.
Stay blessed and focus. Walk good, as we say.
All the best. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for coming on tonight. And there's a lot of discussions and a lot of comments which people have been having there on the side. I tried to look at them. Tony Kelly should be done via the race impact session. There was Star Ademosa. There was Najimel Nanten. I agree, Professor Les. I've also heard people referring to Jamaica and the Caribbean as if Jamaica is not a part of the Caribbean, that point which was flagged up. Agreed, Nicola, but not everyone has a pros and not everyone has solidarity. That was Mel. And they're used to undervaluing us or not paying Black professionals. So let's use this discussion and this topic as a way forward, and people can share it. And the replay is very important as we discuss the race paradox. Why organization fails the race, but actually it's much bigger. The whole aspect and the Maya Angelou, there's a link which I'm going to share at some point that Nicola has sent to me about the words that we speak as well, and those are very powerful. So thank you so much for joining. Those on TikTok, those on Facebook, those on YouTube, those on Facebook, and I believe Instagram may have felt a bit very shifty or very uncomfortable with some of the topics because actually it was closed down. Just to let you know for the record, ladies and gentlemen, not everybody sometimes like to address these issues here, and I try and as a matter of fact, you really get to the point where you really realize and say, hang on a second, we just really need to have our own stuff. We really need to have our own stuff. So thank you very much, and have a good night. And let me just finish the show. Peace out and bye-bye.